The night was eerily silent as the soft hum of the city faded into the background. Inside Nia Graves' jewelry shop, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the gleaming counters, where handcrafted masterpieces once sat, each piece telling a story of passion and precision. But now there was nothing. Nothing but a locked door, shattered only by the brutal reality of what had unfolded inside. The shop, once a sanctuary of beauty and craftsmanship, had become the scene of a chilling mystery. Nia Graves, a respected jeweler known for her impeccable skills and unwavering dedication, was found lifeless in her own establishment. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community that had come to know her as not just a businesswoman, but as a trusted figure, a woman whose talent and kindness had made her shop a local landmark. But when the police arrived, they found something that didn't add up. There was no sign of forced entry, no trail of violence leading into the building. The door was locked from the inside, and yet someone had managed to slip in. As the investigation began, it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary robbery gone wrong. The inventory was meticulously examined, and a disturbing pattern emerged. Only custom, traceable pieces were missing, those items that could be linked back to their owner, pieces that were never meant to leave her hands. The theory of a desperate thief crumbled under the weight of these facts, leaving investigators to wonder who had the means, the access, and the personal motive to betray Nia. A micro-scratch on the lock, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, offered the first clue, an indication that this wasn't just a crime of opportunity. This was personal. The search for answers would soon lead to a suspect with a very familiar face, someone who knew the ins and outs of the shop, and perhaps of Nia's deepest frustrations. Nia Graves was more than just a skilled jeweler. She was a craftsman with a vision. From the moment she opened her boutique, nestled in the heart of the city, it was clear that this was no ordinary jewelry store. Her pieces were more than accessories. They were works of art, meticulously crafted and imbued with personal meaning. Each piece was a testament to her years of dedication, a blend of artistry and precision honed over time. For Nia, jewelry wasn't just about beauty. It was about creating something lasting, something that would carry a piece of its creator with it long after it left the store. Her success didn't come overnight. It was the result of tireless work and an uncompromising attention to detail. As her reputation grew, so did her clientele. Those who walked into Nia's shop were met with a sense of elegance and exclusivity. They trusted her with their most important pieces, heirlooms, engagement rings, and custom designs that were meant to last a lifetime. But success came with its pressures. Nia was known for her perfectionism, her unwavering commitment to quality that often pushed her to the brink. She ran a tight ship, and while this garnered admiration from some, it also created friction among others. As with many small businesses, there were those who weren't content with simply being a part of her world. They wanted more. Some craved recognition, while others sought to claim a piece of her success. Among those who worked for Nia was a young apprentice, eager to learn but struggling with the rigid expectations she set. He had entered her shop with dreams of honing his craft, but his path had not been an easy one. His departure from the shop was marked by a heated argument, a stark contrast to the mentorship Nia was known for. It was a break that left both sides wounded, though Nia, in her usual way, simply moved forward, focusing on her work. Still, the apprentice was not the only one affected by the pressures of the business. As Nia's shop grew, so did the tensions within her inner circle. The perfect facade she had created began to show cracks, and those who had once been her closest allies found themselves questioning their roles in her world. But Nia's strength lay in her ability to push through adversity, to keep moving forward despite the challenges she faced. Now, with her tragic death casting a shadow over everything she built, the question remained: who could have taken everything from her? Who could have betrayed a woman who had given so much to others, even when they didn't deserve it? If you want to follow the investigation as it unfolds and uncover the twisted motives behind this heartbreaking crime, subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. Stay with us as we piece together the clues, explore the relationships, and unravel the mystery surrounding Nia's tragic end. Nia Graves' success was not only built on her technical skill, but also on the relationships she cultivated within her shop. Her boutique, though small, was a hub of creativity, where the meticulous work of crafting jewelry intersected with the personalities of those who shared the space. Nia had always believed that a strong team was the key to maintaining the high standards that defined her work. She surrounded herself with people she trusted, relying on them not just for their skill, but for their loyalty and dedication. Among the most significant of these relationships was her bond with Ethan, her apprentice. Ethan had started as a fresh-faced intern, eager to learn the trade from one of the best. Nia had seen promise in him early on, mentoring him through the intricacies of jewelry making. She invested time in his development, teaching him the finer points of design, technique, and client interaction. To Nia, Ethan represented the future of her craft, a future she was willing to shape with patience and guidance. But, as with many mentor-mentee relationships, the balance was delicate. Ethan's growing sense of entitlement and his struggle to meet Nia's exacting standards began to sour their dynamic. Over time, Ethan's frustration grew. He wanted recognition, a more prominent role within the shop, and the ability to showcase his own designs. Nia, however, remained focused on her work, and her unyielding standards often put a strain on their relationship. Ethan's resentment simmered beneath the surface, manifesting in small acts of rebellion, from missing deadlines to questioning Nia's approach. Despite this, Nia continued to push him, believing that his potential could only be unlocked through discipline. Yet, when the time came for Ethan to leave the shop after a particularly heated argument, the split was far from amicable. Ethan's departure marked the end of a professional relationship that had once seemed full of promise, leaving both Nia and him with unresolved bitterness. But Ethan was not the only person in Nia's life whose relationship with her had complexities. There were other employees, each with their own ambitions, frustrations, and hidden agendas. One such employee, Maria, had been with Nia for several years. Unlike Ethan, Maria had managed to stay under Nia's radar, rarely attracting attention, and yet her quiet demeanor often concealed a more ambitious side. She was a steady presence in the shop, keeping operations running smoothly, but there were whispers that she had long coveted a greater stake in the business. Her patience was seen as loyalty, but in reality it was rooted in a desire for ownership and control. Maria's personal life was often kept private, yet there were rumors of financial struggles, and some believed she would have done anything to secure her future, even if it meant crossing a line. Nia's relationship with her clients was equally complicated. While many admired her craftsmanship, others found her demanding nature difficult to navigate. Her insistence on perfection, while often appreciated by those who valued her work, alienated those who didn't meet her high standards. It was not uncommon for Nia to clash with clients who were less willing to compromise on design, and this sometimes led to strained exchanges. Despite this, Nia remained professional, always putting her art above personal pride. These personal dynamics, Ethan's unresolved anger, Maria's quiet ambition, and the complex relationships Nia had with her clients, painted a picture of a woman who had earned both admiration and resentment. While some would have been content with the status quo, others had ambitions that went far beyond what Nia was willing to offer. The question remained, could one of these relationships, built on years of trust and collaboration, have turned into something darker? Could someone close to Nia have betrayed her in such a devastating way? As investigators began to examine these dynamics, they realized that the path to the truth would not be linear. It was a web of emotions, desires, and unmet expectations, each strand pointing toward a different potential motive. The relationships that had defined Nia's life were now the key to understanding why someone would want to harm her. The discovery of Nia Graves' body sent shockwaves through the local community, but it was the peculiarities of the crime scene that truly unsettled investigators. Nia had been found in her jewelry shop, alone and lifeless, but there were no signs of forced entry. The door was securely locked from the inside, and the windows showed no signs of tampering. The scene was almost too clean, too controlled. It didn't take long for the detectives to realize this was no typical burglary. Someone had entered the shop with precision and knowledge, as if they were supposed to be there. The initial theory of a robbery quickly began to fall apart. The shop was, for all intents and purposes, an open treasure chest of valuable goods, gold, diamonds, and unique custom pieces. But there was nothing missing except for a select few items. These weren't the most expensive pieces, but they were distinctive, custom, traceable designs, each one uniquely crafted with Nia's signature touch. The fact that the thief had chosen only these items raised immediate red flags. This was no random thief looking to sell whatever they could grab. This was someone who knew exactly what they were after. The question wasn't just about what had been stolen, it was about why only these pieces had been targeted. The investigators pored over the security footage, hoping to find something that could shed light on how the killer had gained access. The grainy footage from the night of the crime showed a figure slipping into the shop after hours, their face obscured by a hood. The killer moved with an unsettling calmness, bypassing the traditional security systems without triggering a single alarm. It wasn't until the footage was analyzed in more detail that the investigators noticed something that would change the course of their investigation. The lock on the door had been manipulated. At first glance, it appeared as though the door had simply been opened with the correct key. But as they examined the lock more closely, detectives found something that could not be explained away by simple wear and tear. A microscratch, barely noticeable to the naked eye, was etched along the side of the lock. The scratch was consistent with the use of a 3D printed key mold, something that could only be made with a very specific set of tools. The realization hit the investigators hard. This wasn't a case of someone breaking in through brute force or finding a way to pick a lock. The killer had used a duplicate master key, one that had been expertly crafted, perhaps by someone with intimate knowledge of the shop's operations. The evidence didn't stop there. Analyzing the inventory, it became clear that only custom pieces had been taken, pieces that could be traced back to Nia. The more the detectives dug, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign of desperation. The killer had entered as if they had every right to be there. They knew exactly what they wanted, and they took it. As the investigation deepened, the search for the owner of the 3D printed key mold led detectives to a familiar name, Ethan, the former apprentice who had worked under Nia. Ethan had left the shop several months before after a fallout with Nia over differences in their professional expectations. His departure had been marked by tension, but no one had suspected anything beyond a simple falling out. No one had imagined that the end of their working relationship would lead to something so deadly. It was clear now that the timeline was no coincidence. Ethan had worked in Nia's shop for long enough to know its inner workings. He would have had access to the master keys, the designs, and the very pieces that were stolen. But what had driven him to commit such a betrayal? Was it simply professional resentment, or was there something deeper, a personal grudge that had festered beneath the surface? As the detectives turned their focus on Ethan, they found more unsettling details about his life after leaving the shop. He had been casing the jewelry shop for weeks, and his online purchase of the key mold design only confirmed what the evidence was already suggesting. This was no random act of violence. This was a premeditated crime, one that had been carefully planned and executed with a precision that only someone with intimate knowledge of the shop could achieve. With every new discovery, the investigation began to take shape. The early warning signs were now impossible to ignore. The clues pointed to someone who had both the motive and the opportunity to commit the crime. But there were still questions to be answered. Why had Ethan gone to such lengths to destroy Nia's life? What had she done to drive him to such an extreme? The detectives knew they were closing in on the truth, but the more they uncovered, the more the case became personal. This wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal of the worst kind. As the investigation into Nia Graves' murder deepened, more unsettling details began to emerge. The initial shock of the crime was starting to give way to a troubling realization. This wasn't a random act of violence, nor was it the result of a spur-of-the-moment crime of opportunity. Every new piece of evidence pointed to a premeditated act, a carefully calculated move by someone who had planned this crime down to the smallest detail. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that the killer had a personal connection to Nia. Ethan, the former apprentice, had always been the most obvious person of interest. The discovery that he had purchased a 3D printed key mold design online was not just a coincidence. It was the smoking gun. The micro-scratch on the door's lock was too precise to be the result of any normal key. It was an unmistakable sign that someone had taken the time to craft a duplicate key to gain access when they knew the shop would be empty. This was not a crime of passion or a hasty decision. It was the result of careful planning, and the detectives knew they were dealing with someone who had deeply considered every step. But the question remained, what had driven Ethan to commit such a brutal act? Was it purely professional resentment over his departure from the shop, or had something more sinister been at play? As the detectives dug deeper into his life, they uncovered details that painted a picture of a young man who had been struggling for months, nursing a deep sense of betrayal and rejection. Ethan's departure from the shop had not been amicable. The argument he had had with Nia had been heated, and although the specifics were unclear, it was obvious that the relationship between the two had soured. His departure had been the culmination of months of frustration, and it seemed as though he could not let go of his feelings of injustice. There were also signs that Ethan had been watching the shop for weeks. Surveillance footage showed him loitering nearby on several occasions, his movements casual, as though he was simply passing by. But his repeated presence in the vicinity of the store was anything but casual. It was clear now that he had been casing the shop, learning its routines, its security systems, and its vulnerabilities. He had studied the layout, and most crucially, he had studied Nia. While Ethan's motivations began to take shape, the detectives also started to focus on the stolen items. Unlike a typical robbery, where anything of value might be taken in a desperate bid for money, this theft was more selective. The pieces that were stolen were not the most expensive items in the shop, but they were undeniably significant. These were the custom designs, each piece uniquely crafted by Nia, each one traceable back to her. The items weren't stolen for their monetary value, but for their personal significance. Whoever took them wanted something more than just money. They wanted to erase Nia's presence, to claim a piece of her work, to mark their own ownership over something that had once been hers. The investigation also uncovered that Ethan had the skills to carry out the crime. As an apprentice, he had worked closely with Nia, gaining access to the shop's operations, the vault where the more valuable pieces were stored, and, of course, the master keys. It became evident that the crime wasn't just about revenge. It was about gaining control over something that had once been out of reach. Nia's art, her creations, had become a symbol of everything Ethan could never have. And in his mind, taking those pieces was a way of taking back some of the control he had lost. Detectives also discovered that Ethan had started spending money at a much higher rate than before. His lifestyle had changed. He was living beyond his means, making purchases that didn't match up with his previous income. This pointed to a possible motive: financial gain. However, the absence of money or jewelry in the aftermath of the crime ruled out a traditional robbery, leaving investigators with a chilling conclusion. The stolen pieces were never meant to be sold. They had been taken for their emotional and symbolic value. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized the depths of Ethan's betrayal. It wasn't just the act of murder that made his crime so shocking. It was the calculated nature of it. Ethan had used everything he knew about Nia's shop, her routine, and her vulnerabilities to gain access, all while hiding in plain sight. His actions were cold, deliberate, and deeply personal. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was an act of revenge, carried out with precision and a coldness that sent chills down the spine of everyone involved in the investigation. With the evidence mounting against Ethan, the question now was no longer if he had committed the crime, but why he had gone to such extreme lengths to destroy Nia's life. And as the detectives prepared to close in on him, they realized that the story behind Nia's death was far more complex than they could have ever imagined. The news of Nia Graves' death reverberated through the tight-knit community she had so carefully built over the years. Her jewelry shop, a cornerstone of local craftsmanship, was now a crime scene, a symbol of what had been lost, not just in terms of a talented artisan, but in the personal connection she had fostered with so many. The reactions were swift, and the emotional impact was immediate. For many, Nia had been more than a businesswoman. She had been a mentor, a friend, and a pillar of the community. The loss felt personal. Her employees, who had worked alongside her for years, were struck with disbelief. They had never imagined that the shop they had spent so much time nurturing would be the setting for such a tragedy. Many, especially Maria, who had worked with Nia the longest, were overwhelmed with a mixture of grief and confusion. Nia's death left a void that no one seemed capable of filling. She had been the glue that held everything together, the one who provided guidance, direction, and above all, the standard of excellence that defined her work. Maria, in particular, found herself in a state of shock. She had seen Nia at her most vulnerable in recent months, dealing with personal frustrations, yet she had always believed that Nia would bounce back, as she always did. Now, faced with the horror of her mentor's death, Maria was left to pick up the pieces, and with it, the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. The idea that Nia's death might not have been random or an accident began to weigh on her. How could someone so close to Nia, someone who had been trusted with so much, betray her in such a devastating way? Nia's clients, many of whom had formed deep personal bonds with her over the years, were also left reeling. Their grief was not only for the woman they had trusted, but also for the loss of the craftsmanship she had provided them. For some, Nia had been the artist behind their most cherished pieces, engagement rings, family heirlooms, and custom designs that held significant sentimental value. The thought that someone had entered her shop with the intent to harm her, rather than simply robbing her, was unfathomable. In the midst of the grief and confusion, suspicion began to form. As the investigation progressed, the details of the crime painted a disturbing picture. The detectives began to focus on the fact that only custom, traceable pieces had been stolen. This wasn't the work of a random burglar or someone desperate for cash. The pieces taken were deeply personal to Nia, and the manner in which the killer had entered the shop, the use of a 3D printed key, was evidence that whoever had committed the crime knew the shop well. It wasn't long before the suspicion turned toward Ethan, the former apprentice who had once been under Nia's tutelage. Though Ethan had been dismissed from the shop months before, the investigators knew they couldn't rule him out. His behavior after the crime was telling. His online purchase of a key mold design, the scratch on the lock, these were all pieces of a puzzle that seemed to fit too perfectly. But as the detectives closed in on him, those closest to Nia remained in the dark about the true nature of his involvement. They had known him as a quiet, ambitious young man, someone with dreams of making it in the world of fine jewelry, but they had never imagined he would be capable of such a betrayal. For Nia's family, the devastation was compounded by the question of why. Why would anyone want to harm Nia, someone who had dedicated her life to her craft and those around her? Her family, while shocked and heartbroken, clung to the belief that Nia's legacy, her work, her vision, would endure, despite the brutal way in which she had been taken from them. As the investigation continued to unfold, it became apparent that those closest to Nia, the ones who had worked with her day in and day out, were struggling to reconcile the woman they knew with the possibility of betrayal from within. The emotional weight of the crime was magnified by the realization that Nia had trusted those around her, trusted them with her vision, her business, and her life. To think that someone in her inner circle could have been involved in her death was a truth too painful for many to accept. The investigation into Nia Graves' murder had already uncovered troubling evidence pointing toward a carefully planned crime, but it wasn't until the detectives turned their focus squarely on Ethan, the former apprentice, that the full scope of the betrayal began to take shape. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, each clue more damning than the last. Ethan had been one of Nia's trusted apprentices, a young man eager to make a name for himself in the world of fine jewelry. At first, he had shown promise. Nia had taken him under her wing, teaching him the intricacies of her craft, trusting him with her designs and her business. But over time, Ethan's growing frustration with Nia's perfectionism and his increasing sense of entitlement had strained their relationship. His departure from the shop, though seemingly amicable, had been marked by a heated argument that left both Nia and Ethan with lingering resentment. As the investigation progressed, detectives discovered that Ethan had been spending an unusual amount of time near Nia's shop in the weeks leading up to her death. Surveillance footage from nearby streets showed him loitering around the shop, often for hours at a time. To the casual observer, he appeared to be a young man with nothing better to do than wander the streets. But to the detectives, his actions seemed deliberate. He was casing the shop, studying its routines, its vulnerabilities, and most importantly, the timing of Nia's comings and goings. It was clear now that Ethan had been preparing for something far more sinister than a casual visit. The detectives dug deeper into his recent activities and uncovered a troubling pattern. Ethan had spent a significant amount of money in the months following his departure from Nia's shop, far beyond what his income could justify. His lifestyle had shifted dramatically, new clothes, a more lavish lifestyle. But there was no evidence of a legitimate source of income to explain the changes. It was then that the detectives uncovered a chilling detail. Ethan had made an online purchase for a 3D printed key mold design, the very same design that had been used to create the duplicate key that opened Nia's shop. The realization hit hard. Ethan, with his insider knowledge of the shop's operations and his ability to manipulate its security system, had carefully crafted a key that would allow him to enter the shop undetected. He knew Nia's routine, knew when she would be alone, and knew exactly what he was looking for. It was no longer just a case of theft. It was a carefully executed plan to take not only Nia's life, but also her work, her legacy. The stolen pieces were not valuable in the traditional sense. They were custom designed, one-of-a-kind creations that could be traced back to Nia herself. The stolen items had no real monetary value outside of their personal significance, and it was clear now that Ethan's motive was far deeper than simple financial gain. As the detectives connected the dots, they discovered even more unsettling details. Ethan had been researching 3D printing techniques, spending countless hours online looking for ways to replicate the master key that Nia kept locked in a secure location. He had learned the intricacies of the shop's security systems, and he had the perfect opportunity to strike when Nia was vulnerable. The crime had been premeditated, calculated, deliberate, and executed with cold precision. Ethan had known exactly what he was doing and why. The revelation was a bitter one. Nia, who had trusted Ethan like a son, had been betrayed by the very person she had mentored. The motive for the crime was rooted in more than just professional jealousy. It was personal. Ethan had been consumed by feelings of betrayal, anger, and a deep sense of entitlement. He had wanted more than just recognition. He had wanted control. And in his mind, taking Nia's life, her work, and her legacy was the only way to claim that control. The detectives were now certain of Ethan's involvement in the murder, but the question of why he had gone to such lengths to destroy Nia's life lingered. What had driven him to commit such a brutal and premeditated act? Had it been solely about the stolen pieces, or was there something more to the story? The investigation was nearing its conclusion, but there were still unanswered questions about the depth of Ethan's resentment and the true nature of his relationship with Nia. As the detectives prepared to confront Ethan with the evidence, they knew they were closing in on the truth. The case that had once seemed so mysterious and complex was now clear, but the emotional weight of the betrayal remained heavy. The revelation that someone so close to Nia had committed such a horrific act left an indelible mark on everyone involved in the case. The truth was finally within reach, but it had come at a cost: the loss of trust, the shattering of relationships, and the dark truth that sometimes betrayal comes from the most unexpected places. The consequences of Ethan's actions were swift and unforgiving. Once the detectives confronted him with the mounting evidence, his purchase of the key mold, his surveillance of Nia's shop, and the clear connection between him and the stolen pieces, Ethan had little room to deny his involvement. The legal repercussions were inevitable. Ethan was arrested and charged with the murder of Nia Graves, as well as the theft of her invaluable, one-of-a-kind creations. His trial would become a painful reminder of how deeply personal betrayals could lead to irreversible consequences. For Nia's family, the aftermath of Ethan's betrayal was as devastating as the crime itself. They had trusted him, welcomed him into their lives, and never suspected that the man they had treated like family would turn out to be the very person responsible for destroying everything they held dear. The emotional scars left by Nia's death would linger long after the trial had ended. Her family could not escape the haunting question: how had someone so close to Nia been able to plan such a betrayal without them noticing? How had they failed to see the anger and resentment brewing beneath the surface? As for Nia's legacy, it remained intact in the form of her work. The stolen pieces were recovered, but the sense of loss was profound. Nia had built her reputation not just on her talent, but on the relationships she had fostered within the community. The shop was more than just a business. It was a testament to her artistry, her dedication, and her ability to connect with people on a personal level. In the wake of her death, those who had known her were left to carry on her work, honoring her memory by keeping her craft alive. This case serves as a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how deeply betrayal can cut. Ethan's actions were not just a crime. They were a tragic story of a young man who let his own anger and feelings of rejection cloud his judgment. In the end, he lost everything, and Nia lost her life, all because of a relationship that had turned toxic. What do you think drove Ethan to such a tragic end? Could this have been prevented? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you've experienced betrayal or witnessed a similar story, we'd love to hear your perspective.